heart right here, again, general functions, generate blood pressure, routes bloods, and in terms of the other three functions here, routing blood, blood supply, that's all having to do not just with the heart, but with the cardiovascular system, all right? So it has a series of one-way valves that allows movement into one direction. We'll talk about those valves. Some of you might have heard of them. Regulates blood supply as well. So the more active the tissue, the more you're going to bring blood to it. Now that's true except for one region of the body where we're always going to bring a lot of blood to it. That's the brain. Let's take a look at the main purpose of the heart. Now, most doctors that I know, and when I was learning it through pathology as well as human anatomy and physiology in med school, we actually completely differentiate between the right side of the heart and the left side. What I want you to do is kind of open up the model that you have here. As you open it up, you should see that on one side, the heart on one side, especially in the ventricle region, you're going to see that on one side is pretty thin, and the other side is really thick. So the left side of the heart is going to have a much thicker walls, much stronger muscle, and much more muscle mass. The reason why is because of where it's going to move blood to. Again, as we look at the blood flow right here, blood going to the right side, the main purpose of that blood is to go into the right atrium, right ventricle, and the only place it has to move it to is into the lungs. Very short distance. So, and one other thing is, what we're going to see is when there's a lot of oxygen, increased oxygen in lungs means there's a lot of oxygen available. Is a sign that there's a lot of oxygen, a lot more for red blood cells to pick up. When you have high levels of oxygen in the lungs, we have vasodilation. When we vasodilate, the blood vessels become bigger. The bigger the blood vessel, the lower the pressure required to bring blood through that area. So what we normally see then is, in normal circumstances, like we are at sea level, the more oxygen, the greater the vasodilation, the lower the blood pressure. Why is this important? Well, because we're normally expecting a lot of oxygen in our lungs, the blood vessel diameter in the pulmonary arteries are usually very large. So you don't require a lot of pressure to move blood into the lungs. Even more importantly, what happens if you pressurize something? The more pressurized something is, the faster it moves, right? The faster it moves, well, if we're moving blood too quickly through the lungs, it doesn't have a chance to pick up as much oxygen. So we don't want a high pressure system in the lungs. We want low pressure, so then as blood goes through the lungs, there's time for the red blood cells to have oxygen diffuse through the lung matter into the bloodstream. The faster blood moves through the lungs, the less likely there's going to be efficient carrying of oxygen. So it makes sense then in the walls of the right side, very small compared to the walls on the left side. So it's completely two different situations. The left side of the heart includes the left atrium and the left ventricle, and it's going to eject blood to the rest of the body. Sometimes against the force of gravity, and its main purpose then is to develop and to create enough pressure from the left side so then you can go against gravity and bring blood to the brain and throughout your abdominal system. So in terms of the heart, we have the top area right here that's called, right? So you think apex is the top, right? You're at the apex of your field. Well, here apex just means the tip. So the tip is a very end point right here. That's the apex of the heart. Usually it kind of faces the left nipple area. And we're going to see why that's important in a second. We can actually tell when there's a problem with the heart because the heart's not facing where it should be. What else do we see? The base is the actual top of the heart. That's where all the main vessels enter and exit. It's located in the chest area called the mediastinum. Now, the heart itself will be covered with connective tissue protecting the heart from the lungs. Remember, your normal heart rate, 60 beats per minute. So at 60 beats per minute, or if you exercise 150 beats per minute, you're creating a lot of movement, right? 2.5 beats per second when you're working out, right? So as a heart contracts, the lungs also expand and deflates, right? What happens? Well, there's a lot of movable parts in the chest area. If you have the heart and it's completely attached to the lungs and both of them are moving, there's a big chance that they rub against each other and you create friction, inflammation, and pain. So what do? The heart itself is covered with protective tissue that we call the pericardium. That's what we see here. Now the pericardium completely encases the heart. So then as the heart contracts, the pericardium protects it from any rubbing by the expansion and deflation of the lungs. So then there's no rubbing, there's no friction, and there's no pain. I think there are some hearts that we're going to get next week, and it has the actual pericardium still attached. With the pericardium still attached, the heart looks very, very fatty. And there will be some fat in our heart as well, not as much as in the ones that we usually see. It's a very tight thorax. If you take a look at that right there, because it's so tight, there's always that chance where the lung is going to inflate, is going to rub against the heart as it's contracting. To minimize it, we have the pericardial sac and the pericardium to prevent it. Now, the pericardium contains the fibers and the serous. The fibrous pericardium is just the external tough matter right there. The serous pericardium is internal. It contains the parietal and the visceral pericardium. Now, the only reason I'm mentioning it is that the visceral pericardium is actually found embedded on the heart itself. It's like the pia mater when we compare it to the brain and the spinal cord. You can't remove the pia mater without damaging the brain and the spinal cord. Here, the visceral pericardium is on the external surface of the heart. You can't separate it. Right, the heart wall, and we will be using these names, they sound similar, they mean the same thing. The vast majority of the heart is composed of this, the myocardium. Myocardium is your cardiac muscle, is what allows the heart to work. By contracting, that myocardium, or cardiac muscle, will create pressure and eject blood upwards. Now, in terms of the myocardium, that's what we're seeing here, where you have a lot more. The thickness of the left ventricle is, about 2.5 times the thickness of the right ventricle. It's a sign that you have a lot more myocardium on the left side. All right, now, most of you guys know what the blood pressures are, right? Normally, hopefully you have good blood pressure. 120/70, systolic over diastolic. Now, you guys understand that 120, your systolic blood pressure, is just a measure of your left ventricular pressure. That's it. Right? Your right ventricle does not go that high. Right? Now, we don't want it to be very high, but most people freak out when they realize how low the right ventricular pressure is. Your left ventricular pressure is like your systolic blood pressure, 120. Pretty high pressure. Your right ventricular pressure, assuming that we're at sea level, there's a lot of oxygen, assuming that you don't have any congestive heart failure. Your right ventricular pressure is about 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury. That's it. A sixth of what we see in the left side. Right? It has less muscle. We saw that by looking at the amount of and the thickness of the walls. Right? Now, if you have a problem with, you smoke, right? And you start having, some kind of smoking related, lung issues like fibrosis, pulmonary fibrosis, emphysema, well, that's going to affect your ventricular pressure. And any increase is a big increase. Pectinate muscles. So if you look inside here, the pectinate muscles are formed and they're found on the walls of your right atrium. Muscular ridges found in what looks like the auricle or the elephant's ear. Externally, it looks like the elephant ear right here. We call that an auricle. When we open it up, we see that it's lined with muscle. The muscle is called pectinate muscle. Now, when you open this up and you look at the inside, so we've removed part of this, and now we're looking at the inside, and you see lots of ridges. The ridges are called the trabecular carnate, right? That's what we see here. Just ridging that occurs because the cardiac muscle, they don't lie flat. They're attached to each other. There's a three-dimensional scaffolding shape to it. They're ridges, right, that kind of sticks out. That's a trabecular carnate. Now, when we look at the coronary arteries right here, keep in mind, these are the arteries that usually become clotted when we have an MI. We'll talk about these when we go through the lab in a few minutes. So we'll talk about it as we get through those, so I'm just gonna skip through this right now. All right, I wanna talk about movement of blood and the movement of blood through what main areas first. We're gonna talk about myocardial thickness and functions. Again, right ventricle walls are thinner. They pump blood only to the lungs, and normally lungs are full of oxygen. Because the lungs are full of oxygen, you have vasodilation of the pulmonary artery. You vasodilate the pulmonary artery, that means your artery is larger. And what happens then is it takes less pressure to bring it to that area. That's why the right ventricle is so thin. Right, decrease in O2 in tissues. Right, so left ventricle walls are thicker, they have to pump blood throughout the whole body. Now the weird thing is this, in the lungs right here, right, when you have increased oxygen, it's a good sign. It vasodilates, but only in the lungs. In our rest of the body, in our systemic tissue, increase in oxygen, right, is actually not a great sign. Does it mean that you're not kind of moving blood, you're not being active in that area? Instead, if you're really active, we should see decreased amount of oxygen in that region. Think about when you're jogging. As you're jogging, you're contracting the muscles a lot. What happens? Well, you're going to use up a lot of oxygen to make fuel. So then we can make ATP from that oxygen through aerobic respiration. So when you use up a lot of oxygen, the tissues in that area has low oxygenation. They have low oxygen concentration because they're using all the oxygen because it's being active. So decreased oxygen in the body is a sign of activity. And we need to bring blood to that area that's active. And what happens? Right? When you have decreased O2 in the body, you actually vasodilate to bring more blood in. Weird, right? Right? So we want to bring more blood in. So when we're active, we dilate the blood vessels when we're talking about the rest of the body. So there's a little difference, and we'll talk more about it later on. There's a difference. What happens when there's low oxygen in the lungs and when there's low oxygen in the body. Low oxygen in the lungs is a bad thing. That means you usually have some kind of either disease, pneumonia on one side of the lungs, or you might have a collapsed lung on one side. Would you want to bring blood to that area where there's no oxygen? No. So low oxygen in the lungs, you actually constrict the blood vessels. Low oxygen in the body, you dilate. Right? Low oxygen in the lungs, you vasoconstrict. Why? No point bringing blood to an area of the lung that's got no oxygen. Right? Why bring blood there? There's no oxygen anywhere. So you kind of constrict that area so then you can detour it somewhere else. So just review this when you get a chance to get home. It should make sense, right? If you're active, the tissue is using oxygen, you need more oxygen. So you dilate, leading to that area. So then we can bring more blood and you can continue to be active in that area. All right, and this kind of shows you the difference in the size of the walls. Huge difference, isn't it? Now, the valves, AV valves and semilunar valves, right? The valves provide us a one-way flow of blood. So then you can direct blood from atria to ventricles, ventricles to the main arteries. So let's take a look right here. Right? So here is the left side. Blood is going to, from the lungs, goes into the left atrium. Blood from the lungs now is full of oxygen. It goes into the left atrium, and blood is going to go through the mitral valve. The book will talk about bicuspid, right? We never use bicuspid. The reason why is because on the other side, you have a tricuspid valve. When all hell breaks loose, all you hear is cuspid. You don't hear the bi or the tri. They sound too similar. So we don't like using that when we talk about medicine. Tricuspid and mitral. Is there any way they can be confused? No. So we use mitral instead of bicuspid. Now, I know how many females we normally have in the class, that about 25% of female population have a problem with the mitral valve. A small problem we call a mitral valve prolapse. It's not a big problem, right? Usually it's silent. What happens is that mitral valve, instead of closing and that's it, right? Once it opens, blood goes from the right atrium to the left atrium to the left ventricle, right? Then what happens? Well, now we have to eject that blood into the aorta. So it fills that left ventricle, and now, right, I need to eject that blood forward into the aorta. As we eject blood forward, I want you to think about what happens if you squeeze a water bottle from below, right? You have a water bottle, and you start squeezing from underneath. Well, blood is going to go up, or water is going to go up. Hopefully not blood in there, right? So as that water goes up, it's going to go upwards because you're squeezing from the bottom. That's what's happening in the heart. The contraction of the ventricles starts at the tip. As it starts from the tip, it squeezes upwards. Why is that important? Well, that's where the aorta is. The aorta is above the ventricle. So you need to squeeze from below. As you squeeze from below, you need to open that aortic valve. Aortic valve requires a lot of pressure to open it. So you need to overcome that pressure. Eventually you do that and you eject blood out into the aorta. Now, what would happen if we don't fully close that mitral valve? If this one's fully closed, but it doesn't all the way close. We say you have a, right, mitral valve, right, stenosis, right? And what happens is this. If that valve stays open, you're moving blood upwards, some of that blood goes back into the atrium, right? So we need to make sure that the valve closes completely so we don't have backflow from the left ventricle to the left atrium. Now, in some women, the valves close completely, but the pressure is such that it causes the valve to move up into the atrium. Blood doesn't move back up, but the valve just kind of moves up and shifts to the left atrium, right? Again, because there's no kind of movement of blood in reverse, there's not a real symptomatic issue. We just kind of see it when we do an echocardiogram. Right? Again, lungs bring deoxygenated blood then into the left atrium by way of the pulmonary veins. In the left atrium, it goes past the mitral valve to the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts and injects blood into the aorta. In the process, it moves through the aortic valve. Now, let's think about this and then we'll stop talking about the physiology here. Right? This is route of blood flow through the heart. When you take a look at this number 1 and then this number 5 happens at the same time. Here it looks like it goes in sequence. Blood has to go from the two main veins in our body. The superior vena cava, allowing you to drain deoxygenated blood from your rest of your body, your upper body. Inferior vena cava, from your abdomen and lower body. That blood that's deoxygenated goes up the inferior vena cava. Then it goes into the right atrium. In the right atrium, it goes into the right ventricle. In the process, it goes through this valve called the tricuspid valve. Right? In the right ventricle, now you have to create pressure, and now you can inject blood into the pulmonary artery. In this circulation, right, from the heart to the lungs, from the lungs back to the heart, this is the only time where you'll ever see an artery that's actually blue. Arteries are usually carrying oxygenated blood, right? So they're usually red. Not in this example. Only time when artery is actually blue. So this pulmonary artery or pulmonary trunk brings blood to the left and right lungs, where it gets oxygenated. Now, freshly oxygenated blood from the lungs gets carried in through the pulmonary veins. Then it goes into the left atrium, like we just mentioned. Then the blood goes through the mitral valve. So remember, anything we see bicuspid, we use mitral. All right, it goes through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then contracts to eject blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, right, and into the rest of the body then. So it seems like there's this like sequence, but keep in mind, if there's that sequence and blood only goes into one chamber at a time, right, you're gonna have to wait to receive blood. So what happens in real life is this: as blood goes to the superior vena cava, into the right atrium, blood from the lungs goes through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, right? So 1 to 2 occurs at the same time as 5 through 6 occurs. So at the same time as deoxygenated blood goes into the right atrium, freshly oxygenated blood goes into the left. At the same time when the blood goes into the right ventricle, in the left ventricle, freshly oxygenated blood goes into the left ventricle. At the same time that the right ventricle contracts and ejects blood into the pulmonary trunk, into the pulmonary artery. At that same time, the left ventricle ejects blood into the aorta. So even though it looks like there's a sequence that has to be followed here, understand that what's happening here from number 1 to number 2, right, occurs at the same time as what happens between 5 and 6, right? They are occurring concurrently. Now, what we're gonna see in a second is that there's a little hole. So if you look at your heart right here, if you look on the inside of your atrium, you see a tiny red opening. That tiny red opening is called the coronary ostia. And I'll show it to you on this, in the model in just a second. And it's only found on the right side. It should be on the right side, right atrium, right? That opening that's red allows blood to go into that opening, so then it can then be directed to the coronary arteries. Right. I will stop right here, and we'll continue with this, like the physiology next week.